This is Verdurin, I'm Pierre Delancey. Are art and literature exempt from the now constant debunking and fact-checking of every public utterance? Might our most paranoid fantasies, from shadowy conclaves controlling global events to monsters folding under the bed, be, in their own way, a kind of art? These questions were the makings of Paranoia, a symposium held at Verdurin in February 2025. Paranoia is an attempt to drag the dark, suspicious impulses that animate all artistic interpretation into the open, via the time-honored method of the symposium. This episode is a recording of a talk by Justin Smith-Ruiu. Justin reflects on how conspiracy-quashing slogans like "trust the science" are in fact only functional under very specific conditions. The procedures invoked by fact-checkers and disinformation specialists may already be in the first phase of the obsolescence. Justin also touches on his recent dabblings in metafiction, in particular his experiments with pseudonyms and heteronyms via his publication, The Hinternet. This project proposes a way for writers to induce in readers a suspicion that the most basic anchors of a text, like the name of its author, for example, might be just a lie. Justin is a professor of the history and philosophy of science at the Université Paris. He's the author of The Internet is Not What You Think It Is and Irrationality, a history of the dark side of reason. He has also authored monographs on Leibniz and early modern philosophy. He is a contributor to the New York Times, Harper's, N+1, and The Point. Paranoia was organized with Thomas P. Mohammed Lambert. You will find links to further information about the symposium, the Hinternet, Justin's book Irrationality, as well as other programs at Verdurin in the show notes.
I'm going to talk to you in three different personae. First as a human being, second as a philosopher, and third as a creative writer. I think I have a pretty good claim to be all three of those. And I want to say at the outset, originally I had thought I would do a kind of summary of all that had gone before. I can't possibly do that. I do want to say that I share much of the same sensibility as Thomas against dogma. I think it's just obvious that simply waking up to the fact that the official line on X or Y is worthy of skepticism does not entail that you should automatically affirm the opposite. And I think we have a lot of that dynamic in contemporary conspiratorial discourse. With Sam, and perhaps also with Ricoeur, I would also affirm that human beings simply are hermeneutical creatures, and we are bound always, almost as a kind of pareidolia, to get back to an earlier phenomenon evoked, we're always going to be seeing faces in things, so to speak. So let me talk to you a bit as a person. Let me start with this opening gambit to kind of warm your hearts towards me as I begin by showing myself as vulnerable, but also, more importantly, to show you a bit of the class habitus I emerge from and that I soaked up early on. You might be able to read into this picture what it in fact is. The era is the 1970s. The family is American, more particularly Western American, more particularly the descendants or the participants of the Dust Bowl migration from Arkansas and Oklahoma during the Great Depression. There's also Mormonism in the mix. That man, my grandfather, his grandfather emigrated from England as a devotee of Joseph Smith. He's said to have been present when Joseph Smith witnessed the angel, or he was one of the witnesses. And my grandfather ran away, hitchhiked from Utah to Los Angeles and became a hard-drinking, hardcore atheist his whole life with rather, let's say, reactionary political views. That one, my cousin, I'm not going to do everyone. My cousin is today a used car lot manager and a hardcore prepper and Christian identitarian with 7 or 8 children of his own. My grandmother from Arkansas is salt of the earth, never had an opinion, as far as I know, about anything political at all. Yeah, again, I'm not going to do everyone. That's me. I don't have any concepts in that space at all yet. But as I said, I'm soaking it up, and that's what's important. Some of the people who are not pictured include my father, and I was looking frantically for a photograph of him about 3 or 4 years before he died with Alex Jones that he had proudly posted on Facebook, and in which he said, "I met this nice young man. He's full of very passionate ideas." Also my uncle, so my grandparents' other 2 children, who is a confirmed, just kind of out in the open, unrestrained neo-Nazi white supremacist. And I find all of this very interesting because I saw in my father a kind of evolution or devolution perhaps from a kind of what I took to be at the time milquetoast mainstream GOP conservatism in the 1980s that had degenerated by the aughts into something much closer to people like Ramsey Clark, the turncoat former, Secretary of State, who became one of these difficult to position simultaneously, both radical right and radical left, loudmouth, cranky old men. And I do want to emphasize the gender part of this. Lyndon LaRouche also comes to mind, a cranky old man. Men who are full of hot-headed ideas, but also seem angry that no one will listen to them, right? And that was definitely my father. I think in my uncle's case, what I suspect, and I'm not gonna I'll give you a 15-second theory of anti-Semitism. I think it's something like the intellectuals' bigotry, right? That is to say, his parents, those 2, probably had no opinions at all as regards relations between Christians and Jews. It just didn't come up. Everybody looked the same. They definitely had prejudices against markedly racialized others, but not against people who looked the same. So in the uncle's case, it was kind of like a sort of refinement, like an ability to discern more from the landscape of social reality. Anyhow, as for my father, noticing this devolution and noticing this kind of increasing crankiness, around the time he was the age that I am now, that's when I first noticed it, kind of made me think that there's something in the paternal line, and it manifests itself in the course of one's aging. And I have to say, and this is all just prefatory, I have to say that really scares me about myself and also makes me wonder how I ended up here at precisely this age and precisely this moment in life, right? It's as if it is a genetic condition that as we Smith men age, we become increasingly convinced that we have a message for people and it's something they don't know, right? And so I want you to just kind of hold on to that for a while. And also, if I can introduce another gendered dimension, it seems to me, and I didn't mention my grandmother's personality for nothing, it seems to me that it is the force, the weight of the kind of no-nonsense, ultimately humanistic, and in many cases, but not necessarily, kind of mainstream establishment liberal women in our lives that hold us back from our worst possible excesses. And in my uncle's case, such a woman is absent, right? Now, maybe I'll come back to some of that, but again, I'd like to move on to some reflections drawing on philosophy. I think, and again, I think I'm about to say things that I wouldn't have been prepared to say 4 or 5 years ago. It might be because of changes in me. It might be because of changes in the world. And over the past decade or so, I am often shocked at how strangely my personal development is recapitulating or manifesting at a micro scale the larger world historical unfolding. I don't know why it's doing that, and maybe I'm even a bit paranoid about this strange kind of locking of the two levels. But philosophically speaking, what I would be prepared to say is that there are things that are perfectly true, but that really are better left unacknowledged. And I do think that there are people, and again, I put this in gendered terms, and that's how it plays out in my own family, but it's not necessarily the case. There are people like these level-headed, no-nonsense women who can hold us back from acknowledging true things because it's not going to go well for you, or something like that. And I can give an example. Again, it would be to venture into touchy territory to choose my examples unwisely. But here's one I've been thinking about recently, where perhaps it is better to defer sometimes to what we recognize inwardly to be proper myths. And Nina, I was talking to you yesterday, and I described this in terms of gentlemanliness, the gentlemanly deference to other people's serving as windsocks for popular myths. When is it a good time to do that? One thing I've been thinking about recently, and let me keep things relatively distant and safe by placing them in the United States, the common claim that I've heard all my life, because I was born after the civil rights movement, that there is no such thing as separate but equal. So this was first articulated in a Supreme Court case in the context of the move for school integration in the United States during the civil rights era. So the claim then, after it was first articulated, evolved into both a national piety and an expression of political will. And at the same time, it definitely also squelched real alternatives that were being promoted not just by white Southern segregationists, but also, for example, by Marcus Garvey, right? And either the Back to Africa movement or the idea of carving out an ethno-state in the US South for the descendants of slaves. There were real viable alternatives, and it was not prima facie evident that the most humanistic solution was going to be integration. And there are indeed other historical multi-ethnic states that have found other solutions, or at least partial solutions, for similar problems. So another way of putting this then is that the affirmation that there's no such thing as separate but equal really is just a bit of propaganda. Now, propaganda, as you probably know, is not necessarily a bad thing. The term is what neuter plural active participle that is formed on the model of agenda, right? The agenda is things to be done. Propaganda is things to be propagated, right? That's all it is. That's what the Jesuits had in mind. That's why you can go study in the archives of the De Propaganda Fide in Rome, because the faith is to be propagated, right? It's totally, I don't want to say innocent, but it's totally neutral with respect to value. And indeed, that neutrality becomes arguably positive in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution, but that's what also transformed it in my part of the world into a bad word, right? So there's a fascinating history to it, but if we just take it as that which is to be propagated, then indeed you can see how separate but there's no such thing as separate but equal is just classic propaganda. So then we're faced with a moral problem. Ultimately, it's a moral problem and not an epistemological one. Which propaganda is worth supporting? And the only possible answer is that it's the kind that suits our politics. And this works fairly well as long as you have a unified polity, perhaps with some dissent, but there was arguably such a successful coup in terms of public opinion in US history in the second part of the 20th century that the affirmation of the correctness of the path that was pursued on the basis of the claim that there is no separate but equal seemed virtually unassailable, right? Unassailable in its foundations, even if there were cranks on the margins, right? And again, I'm just using crank in a strictly descriptive way. When a polity is less unified, as that certainly is the case in the United States and in the UK today, the rejection of official pieties takes the form of what are dismissed or what the establishment hopes to dismiss as paranoid conspiracy theories. And the proliferation of so many in the present moment beyond the kind of material technological underpinning that would explain this kind of, I think, in a more immediate causal way, is obviously a kind of measure of the fracturing of the sense of a unified polity. So now, as I've confessed, I'm surrounded by good, loving establishment liberal women, and I don't want to disappoint them. For that reason, there are a lot of things I think I will just not broach. There are places I just will not go. And I'd like to ask everyone to reflect whether there are not such places for themselves as well. It's places where in your most lucid moments, you are prepared to say, yeah, actually, the only reason I adhere to the official line is because there would be too much risk of social death, familial death. Forget about public reputation. Just think about getting chewed out by your mother, right? I mean, there are things that we don't want to make central to our identities. My uncle decided to just choose the one side rather than the other, right? With significant consequences for the rest of his life. So there are some theories I won't even entertain, even if in my most honest moments I find myself inwardly prepared to recognize that my rejection of these theories is not like Descartes, or is much like Descartes' beliefs prior to his undertaking his method of radical doubt. My refusal to consider certain possibilities is based, like Descartes' premeditation's refusal, only on prejudice and conformity. And I, for one, am willing to admit that. But I don't think it is such a flaw, because I don't think that our totality of propositions we're willing to affirm as true is primarily to be understood as a report that we're giving to those around us on the evidence that has been presented to us. That is treating all of life as if it were a court case, and it's just obviously not. That's not how our beliefs work. And I can take many kind of authorities from the past century or so of philosophy. I can talk about Wilfrid Sellars if you want to take it in an analytic philosophy of language direction. I can take Bruno Latour if you want to take the emphasis on matters of concern over matters of fact. But there is an overwhelming kind of panel of authorities who would encourage us to think somewhat more thoroughly about just how normative, that is to say, just how value-based belief is always bound to be for socially embedded creatures, right? And so, I mean, I don't know how much you want to hear about Bruno Latour from me, but there's a common analysis that he offers of the notion of thing, right? What things are there? Give me your ontology. Give me the list of stuff there is, right? Okay, let me start my list of things. Well, there are tables, there are microphones, there are smartphones, and I can just go on and on and on until I've covered the whole universe. But even the word thing is at its origin a political notion. That is to say, the ding in ancient Germanic tribal society was something like the Senate or the Assembly. The term survives at least in one Germanic language today, where the Icelandic parliament is the all thing, right? The all thing, that's a literal morpheme by morpheme gloss of res publica, right? So we still have vestiges of a time when things were not simply objects to be enumerated by in our scientific ontology through a kind of inventory, but rather were invitations to make a choice as to whether we were going to pay attention to them or not. That is to say, invitations to share in the same matter of concern, right? I think you might know that around 2004, Latour, also at the same time, the American historian of science Lorraine Daston was coming to similar conclusions over the course of the 80s and 90s. She had written pretty playfully and imaginatively about natural history museums in a way that at least insinuated that the scientific claims about the order of nature, including the history of evolution, were a bunch of hot air, right? And by the early aughts, she and Latour both realized that their language was being adopted and adapted for the little descriptive labels on the exhibitions at the Creation Science Museum in Petersboro, Kentucky, right? Where they showed cavemen and dinosaurs frolicking with one another, right? And this is, I think this is not the first moment this has come up today, but this is a moment of, let's say, passing of the torch of postmodern playfulness, I think, from one side of the political spectrum to the other, right? That's kind of the pivotal moment as I see it, though of course we could pick out other ones. So in 2004, Latour kind of recoils and say, holy shit, what have I been fomenting without even realizing it? And then much of the rest of his career was directed at saving the kind of grounding of truth in what he calls matters of concern from people who would use that grounding irresponsibly. And what is responsibility? Who is a responsible person? That is a determination we make in the sphere of values and not in the sphere of evidence, right? And that's just our predicament. We're stuck, right? And so I think I'll try to well, let's see, did I have anything else to say about that? Oh, yes. So let me talk just maybe 3 to 5 minutes about some other important themes in the philosophy of science. We have, going back decades now in kind of analytic philosophy of science, people like Larry Loudon, who have introduced the famous demarcation problem, what exactly are the criteria that bound pseudoscience off from science. nobody really knows. In the 1970s, the self-proclaimed anarchist philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend was both kind of denouncing the principal establishments of science, while at the same time saying, indeed, it's good that the American National Institutes of Health has at least a small budget for alternative holistic therapies on the grounds that you never know, right? It's kind of like this Leibnizian methodology that is in fact an anti-methodology. Everybody, even the weirdest guys, is interested in some of the same things, like, for example, healing the body, right? So go check out what the alchemists are doing, do it under a pseudonym if you have to, like Leibniz did, but still, you don't know where the truth is going to come from, right? And it's all good. And so this is something that philosophers of science recognize is really not a viable boundary. Even the most conservative or kind of, again, establishment philosophers of science recognize that we don't know what pseudoscience is. There's also a lot of very interesting work by people in the history of science on, I can think, for example, of Margaret Wertheim, who wrote a wonderful book called Physics on the Fringe, on people who are self-described outsider physicists, right? People who are like mobile home park managers in Oregon who go to the annual outsider physics conference and talk to each other about whether the fundamental basis of reality is smoke rings or rather water, or things like this, like radical alternatives that take us back, like pre-Milesian theorizing. And the argument is that this is ultimately just an expression of a frustration at being left out, right? Just like the men in my family, I think, felt a frustration when the editors of newspapers rejected their letters to the editor and wanted to be heard, right? And it's just people who want to be heard. So I think all of these reflections so far bring me to the kind of post-pandemic moment and what I take to be the complete collapse of liberal monopoly on authority in at least the prevailing mainstream culture in the United States. As I see it, the moment that this happened was when people started putting yard signs in front of their suburban homes in Princeton or New Haven or wherever that said, "Trust the science." That, to me, was a betrayal of a 400-year tradition and effectively the nail in its coffin. I think society has moved on to grasping for alternative grounding of our convictions that no longer looks to the external world to do the lifting for us, so to speak. And the trust the science yard signs were the last gasp of the idea that the external world was going to do that for us. So now, like it or not, all we've got are matters of concern, right? And the Princeton yard signs announced that that matters of fact had their day. And incidentally, I think that this in part explains the popularity of simulationism. In addition to its being a variety of neo-Gnosticism, it's also an expression of, how should I put it, a broad shift after, it's been a long time since Newton's Principia Mathematica, but 1687 to 2020 or so was the reign of physics. And now, if we could borrow a more useful term from French, now we've entered the reign of informatics. And it's going to stay that way for at least the rest of my lifetime. I said before that, that the external world's not going to hold our hands. It's not going to tell us what to believe and not to believe, that all we've got are matters of concern. The era of matters of fact is over. So how can one be responsible? What is it to be responsible given given that science is dead, if I can put it that bluntly. Well, for some years, and if I can move to the creative writing work now, I've been involved in something called the Aesthetical Society for the Transcendental and Applied Realization, now incorporating the Society of Aesthetic Realizers, also known as ESTARCER, who are scholars who work on the history of a quasi-secret, or at least self-sequestering society known as the Order of the Third Bird, that seems to be something like what the Freemasons are for architecture and its place in society. The Order of the Third Bird is for the visual arts. That's one way of glossing what they do. And we've written up all kinds of crazy reports and protocols. This culminated in 2021 with this book called In Search of the Third Bird, proceedings exemplary essays from the proceedings of ESTARCER, of which I was a co-author, but in truth, also wrote under dozens of different pseudonyms in this 800-page volume. The proceedings of ESTARCER do not exist, so this is a book of scholarly articles from a non-existent journal. Why were we doing all of this? Well, if we're not being recorded, I can confess that in the 2010s, through the 2010s, we were doing this because we were just pure Schillerian, imaginative, playful spirits, and we had a lot of excess energy, and we hated our jobs. We hated our day jobs, right? And so for me, this was the discovery of the imagination, right? Whereas I had spent many years trying to flex my muscles as a logician and whatever else. For my collaborators, around 2018, people started accusing them of being too Ivy League, too twee. This sounds a lot like a dining club kind of jeu de société sort of thing, right? It's embarrassing. You should grow up. Right? My collaborators mostly grew up, and now they are running nonprofits and promoting the arts in prison education programs and all sorts of laudable stuff. But the playful spirit is dead. Where did the playful spirit go? I kind of get the sense that it's here tonight a bit. And meanwhile, I've just been plodding ahead kind of against the age, or what I thought was against the age in this kind of work. So we've already heard the Hinternet mentioned. I write book reviews dated to 2029 about sperm whale epistemology under an assumed name, Edwin Reiner Grieb. He is a bioacoustician and a computational linguist at Caltech/Petco in Monterey, California. His book was published by OUP Costco in 2029. My editor at OUP got furious with me for writing that. And I think it's an interesting, and let me just briefly tell you about one more project, which is the OrtCloud review. It will be out later this year. It includes one of our Sams here, Sam Jennings. It also includes Sam Chris, whom some of you know. It includes journal entries from Kristen Rupenian, the author of Cat Person, which might be autofiction and might be actual journal entries for which we have facsimiles. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that doesn't tell you what it's doing, unlike, say, Andy Borowitz's satire in The New Yorker, where they don't want New Yorker's readership to get confused, so they put big block letters at the top of the page that say satire, right? And of course, when you've got that framing, it's going to fall flat. It will always fall flat. So the only way to do the chicken walk at the boundary between imagination and seriousness, I think, is necessarily to not tell people what you are doing or why. I'm letting the guard drop a bit tonight, but that is key. Why is that key? Well, I think, and there would be a discussion that we could have for days and days. I think Thomas might have some interesting thoughts about this. As I see it, from Lucian of Samosata in the 1st century, a wonderful ancient Greek science fiction writer, takes a trip to the moon, listens in with a giant disc prosthesis to all the conversations that are happening on Earth in the first century. It's wonderful stuff. So from Lucian of Samosata up through at least Cervantes and later, I see evidence of an unceasing anxiety that fiction writers bring to their work regarding the moral weight of making stuff up, right? You're not supposed to make stuff up, right? You're supposed to tell the truth. So it is a fundamentally naughty activity. It is something you should be slapped on the wrist for, until writing fiction became part of the project of construction of national identity in the 19th century, right? That's when it gets professionalized, and that's when it gets whitewashed, and that's when it turns into something that people aspire to do and put on their business cards, so to speak, right? And so, to me, ironically, paradoxically, at the present moment, which I've characterized in an earlier part of my reflections here, paradoxically, the best way to be responsible with matters of concern is to get a bit naughty in the way that I have suggested, and to stop pretending the way academics in the humanities are still pretending, to stop pretending to be purveyors of evidence-based truth, to be purveyors of matters of fact, right? And to start instead risking getting a little bit naughty and getting slapped on the wrist for it, right? And I think I'll stop there. I probably kind of insinuated already that I'm in some career trouble at the moment that I could tell you about over dinner. But I think overall, the future is stuff like this, and academia is over. Okay, so thank you.
This episode was mixed by Daniel Neal. Thanks for listening, and join us next time.